Welcome back to Sigil Sanctum, where we uncover the hidden truths that shape our reality. Before we dive into today's investigation, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below, because what we're about to uncover affects every corner of our planet, from the gleaming skyscrapers of Manhattan to the remote villages of rural Asia. Your geographic location might determine how directly you've felt this ancient force's influence in your daily life. Today, we're about to embark on a journey that will fundamentally alter how you see the world around you. We're going to examine one of history's most terrifying and persistent deities, Moloch. When most people hear this name, if they recognize it at all, they conjure images of ancient bronze statues with bull heads, screaming children being fed into furnaces, and barbaric rituals from a bygone era of human civilization. They imagine dusty archaeological sites, biblical condemnations, and primitive societies that we've supposedly evolved beyond. But here's what will disturb you to your core. This ancient god didn't disappear with the fall of Carthage, the destruction of the Temple of Solomon, or the conquest of Canaan. He didn't vanish when Christianity spread across Europe, or when the Enlightenment supposedly ushered in an age of reason. Instead, Moloch evolved. He adapted. He learned to speak the language of progress, efficiency, and necessity. And today, right now, as you're watching this video, he operates through systems so sophisticated, so embedded in the fabric of our civilization, that most people never realize they're feeding him their most precious offerings. This isn't just ancient history we're discussing today. This isn't academic theology or archaeological curiosity. This is about the invisible machinery that runs our modern world, the sacrificial logic that's embedded so deeply in our institutions, our economy, our politics, and even our personal lives that we've learned to call it normal. We're going to explore why some of the most powerful people on Earth still gather under symbols that directly echo these ancient rituals, and why understanding Moloch isn't just about understanding the past, it's about understanding the present moment and the future that's being built around us. The question we're really asking today isn't whether Moloch existed in ancient times. Archaeological evidence has settled that debate conclusively. The real question, the one that should keep you awake at night, is whether he ever really left, or did he simply learn to wear a suit and tie? By the end of this investigation, you'll never look at a corporate earnings report, a government policy, announcement, or even a social media algorithm the same way again. You'll start to recognize the ancient patterns hiding in plain sight, the sacrificial logic that demands we give up what we value most in service of systems that promise us security, prosperity, and progress in return. So buckle up, because we're about to pull back the curtain on one of the most disturbing yet essential truths of our time. The god of sacrifice didn't die, he went digital. To understand how Moloch operates in our modern world, we must first confront the brutal reality of his ancient manifestation. This isn't the sanitized version you might have encountered in Sunday school or introductory world religion courses. This is the raw, documented, archaeologically verified truth about systematic human sacrifice on an industrial scale. Moloch emerges from the historical record not as myth or metaphor, but as documented, brutal reality. The Hebrew Bible doesn't speak of him in allegorical terms. It treats him as a clear and present danger to Israelite society. In Leviticus 18:21, the command is explicit and urgent. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Moloch, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. This isn't poetic language, it's emergency legislation, trying to stop a practice that was actively threatening the community. The Book of Kings provides even more disturbing historical context. It records that even Solomon's successors, kings who should have known better, made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire in the valley of Hinnom, just outside Jerusalem's walls. This valley, Gehinnom in Hebrew, became so associated with horror, suffering, and the smell of burning flesh that its name Gehenna became synonymous with hell itself in later Jewish and Christian tradition. The very word we use for damnation comes from a real place where real children were burned alive in systematic religious rituals. If you're finding this investigation as disturbing and eye-opening as I am, please subscribe to Sigil Sanctum. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid to confront uncomfortable realities. And your support means everything as we continue to uncover the hidden forces shaping our world. But it's the archaeological evidence that truly brings home the systematic, industrialized nature of these sacrificial practices. Recent excavations have validated these biblical accounts with chilling, undeniable precision. In 2014, a comprehensive archaeological survey of Carthaginian sites revealed over 20,000 urns, containing the cremated remains of infants and young children. Each urn was carefully labeled with inscriptions dedicating the offering to Moloch Baal-Hamun, the Carthaginian version of this sacrificial deity. Carbon dating and forensic analysis confirmed these practices continued for over 600 years across multiple generations and various political regimes, suggesting this wasn't the aberrant behavior of a few mad kings, but a core institutional practice of an entire civilization. Dr. Patricia Smith's groundbreaking forensic analysis of Carthaginian remains published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, revealed details that make the horror even more systematic and calculated. Many of the child victims showed traces of sedatives in their bone marrow, suggesting these weren't frenzied, spontaneous rituals driven by religious ecstasy. Instead, they were carefully planned, medically assisted procedures designed to minimize struggle and maximize the ritual's effectiveness. The Carthaginians had developed sophisticated bronze collection vessels with precise drainage systems, standardized cremation protocols that ensured complete incineration, and even specialized hereditary priesthoods whose entire social function was managing these sacrificial operations. The consistency across cultures and centuries is what makes this evidence truly staggering. From the Canaanite Tophet sites in modern-day Israel and Palestine to the Phoenician colonies scattered across Spain, Sardinia, and North Africa, archaeologists have uncovered the same architectural patterns: circular stone platforms designed for optimal heat distribution, sophisticated drainage systems for collecting and disposing of bodily fluids, amphitheater seating arrangements that allowed hundreds of spectators to witness each sacrifice, and storage facilities for the bronze implements used in the rituals. What's particularly disturbing is that these societies didn't hide their sacrificial practices or treat them as shameful aberrations. Quite the opposite, they celebrated them as essential civic duties, as proof of their devotion to divine will, and as necessary investments in their civilization's continued prosperity. Carthaginian coins from the 4th century BCE openly depict Moloch imagery, suggesting that association with child sacrifice was considered a mark of religious legitimacy rather than social stigma. The economic dimension of these practices reveals their truly systematic nature. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Mediterranean shows that wealthy families could purchase substitute offerings, expensive pottery, precious metals, or high-quality livestock to replace their children on the altar. Meanwhile, poor families had no such alternatives. Their children were the only currency they possessed that held sufficient value in the divine economy. Moloch worship, even in ancient times, was fundamentally a system of class-based human sacrifice, a religious practice that literally fed on inequality and used divine authority to justify the systematic murder of the poor's most precious possessions. Recent isotope analysis of the sacrificed children's remains has revealed another horrifying dimension. Many of the victims weren't even from the local population. They were children from conquered territories, prisoners of war, or individuals purchased specifically for sacrificial purposes. This suggests that Moloch worship wasn't just about appeasing the gods during times of crisis. It was a regular, ongoing practice that required a steady supply of victims to maintain divine favor. The theological framework that justified these practices provides crucial insight into how systematic evil can become normalized and even celebrated. Moloch wasn't worshipped as a cruel god who demanded suffering for its own sake. He was understood as a rational deity who operated according to clear transactional principles. You gave him what was most precious to you: your children, your future, your genetic legacy, and in return, he provided what was most essential for your society's survival: military victory, agricultural abundance, protection from natural disasters, and economic prosperity. This transactional understanding of sacrifice created what modern economists would recognize as a commitment mechanism. By demanding the ultimate sacrifice, Moloch worship ensured that devotees had to demonstrate absolute sincerity in their requests for divine intervention. You couldn't half-heartedly petition for rain during a drought if you weren't willing to burn your firstborn to prove how desperately you needed divine assistance. The system was designed to separate genuine need from casual desire, and it did so by demanding a price so terrible that only the most desperate would pay it. The archaeological record shows us that this system worked, at least from the perspective of those who administered it. Carthage became one of the wealthiest and most powerful civilizations in the ancient Mediterranean. Their colonies spread across North Africa, Spain, and Sicily. Their naval technology was centuries ahead of their competitors. Their trading networks reached from Britain to the Persian Gulf, and through it all, they maintained their sacrificial practices, convinced that their prosperity depended on their willingness to feed their most precious possessions to the bronze god with outstretched arms. Understanding this historical foundation is crucial because it reveals that Moloch worship wasn't the product of primitive thinking or pre-rational superstition. It emerged from sophisticated civilizations that had developed complex mathematics, advanced metallurgy, innovative agricultural techniques, and extensive commercial networks. They weren't barbarians who didn't know any better. They were highly educated, technologically advanced societies that had calculated the costs and benefits of systematic human sacrifice and decided it was worth it. That's what makes the modern parallel so disturbing. We like to think we've evolved beyond such barbaric practices, but the psychological and institutional frameworks that enabled ancient child sacrifice are still operating today. They've just learned to speak different languages and wear more sophisticated disguises. Understanding Moloch requires understanding something far more uncomfortable than ancient religious practices: It requires confronting the psychological mechanisms that allow entire civilizations to rationalize, systematize, and ultimately celebrate the systematic destruction of their most vulnerable members. Modern behavioral psychology, social psychology, and neuroscience provide disturbing insights into how ordinary human beings, people who love their own children, who feel genuine compassion for suffering, who consider themselves moral and decent, become active participants in systems designed to consume human lives. The key mechanism is what psychologist Albert Bandura identified as moral disengagement, the cognitive process by which normal people convince themselves that harmful acts serve a greater good. Bandura's research, conducted over decades at Stanford University, demonstrated how quickly and completely individuals adapt to systematic cruelty when it's presented as necessary, authorized by legitimate authority, and embedded in routine institutional practices. But Bandura's work only scratched the surface. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment revealed something even more unsettling. When people are placed in institutional roles that require them to inflict suffering on others, they don't just comply reluctantly, they often begin to enjoy it. The guards in Zimbardo's simulated prison weren't told to be cruel to the prisoners, but within 48 hours, they had developed elaborate psychological torture techniques that they implemented with enthusiasm and creativity. Stanley Moloch's experiments took this understanding even further. His research showed that approximately 65% of ordinary people will inflict what they believe to be lethal electric shocks on innocent victims, if instructed to do so by someone in a white lab coat. The subjects in these experiments weren't psychopaths or sadists, they were normal individuals who had been recruited from newspaper advertisements. They experienced genuine distress while administering the shocks, but they continued anyway, because the authority figure assured them it was necessary for the advancement of scientific knowledge. What makes these findings relevant to understanding ancient Moloch worship is that they reveal the psychological infrastructure that makes systematic sacrifice possible. The Carthaginian parents who placed their children in bronze arms weren't monsters, they were ordinary human beings, who had been placed within institutional frameworks that redefined child murder as civic duty, parental love as divine service, and personal anguish as proof of sincere religious devotion. Ancient Moloch worship incorporated every element that modern psychological research has identified as essential for moral disengagement. First, it provided euphemistic labeling. The children weren't being murdered, they were being passed through the fire or given to the god. The language sanitized the reality and made it easier for participants to avoid confronting the true nature of their actions. Second, it established moral justification through religious authority. The priests who administered the sacrificial system weren't presenting it as arbitrary cruelty, but as essential cosmic maintenance. The gods required these offerings to maintain the natural order, protect the community from disasters, and ensure continued prosperity. Refusing to participate wasn't just personal selfishness, it was cosmic irresponsibility that put the entire civilization at risk. Third, it displaced responsibility through institutional hierarchy. Individual parents weren't making personal decisions to murder their children, they were fulfilling religious obligations established by divine command and administered by legitimate religious authorities. The priests, in turn, weren't acting on personal impulses, but were following ancient protocols handed down through generations of religious tradition. Fourth, it minimized or distorted the consequences through ritualistic pageantry. The drums that accompanied the sacrificial ceremonies weren't just religious music. They were acoustic camouflage designed to mask the sounds of suffering. The elaborate costumes, the ceremonial processions, the community festivals that surrounded the sacrifices all served to transform individual tragedies into collective celebrations. Fifth, it established moral contrasts through selective comparison. The Carthaginians could point to neighboring societies that practiced even more extensive human sacrifice, or to barbarian tribes that killed children in less ritualized, supposedly less humane ways. Their own practices seemed moderate and civilized. In comparison, even as they systematically burned thousands of infants alive, recent neuroscience research has revealed why these psychological mechanisms are so effective. Dr. Michael Gazzaniga's studies of the human brain's interpreter function show that we're essentially biological believing machines. Our brains are hardwired to find patterns, assign causation, and create coherent narratives even when presented with random or contradictory information. When children's deaths coincided with military victories, successful harvests, or favorable weather patterns, the correlation felt like proof of divine intervention rather than statistical coincidence. Dr. Jonathan Haidt's research on moral psychology reveals another crucial dimension. His studies show that humans make moral judgments primarily through emotional intuition rather than rational analysis, then use reasoning primarily to justify conclusions they've already reached emotionally. This means that once a community becomes emotionally invested in a particular moral framework, like the belief that child sacrifice is necessary for divine favor, rational arguments against that framework become psychologically threatening and are typically rejected regardless of their logical merit. The economic incentives embedded in ancient sacrifice systems, created what behavioral economists call commitment traps. Once a society invested significant resources, emotional, financial, and institutional, in the belief that sacrifice influenced divine behavior, any improvement in their circumstances was attributed to proper ritual performance, while any disaster was blamed on insufficient devotion or improper execution of the sacrificial protocols. The system became self-reinforcing and immune to falsification. Archaeological evidence reveals the sophisticated nature of these psychological manipulation techniques. Carthaginian sacrifice sites were designed as amphitheaters that created collective witness experiences. The community wasn't just observing individual tragedies. They were participating in shared religious drama that reinforced group identity and collective commitment to the sacrificial system. The architecture itself was designed to generate specific psychological and emotional responses that made resistance to the system more difficult. The most chilling aspect of the psychological research is how it reveals the hierarchical nature of ancient sacrificial systems. Evidence from multiple archaeological sites suggests that wealthy families could substitute expensive goods, precious metals, exotic animals, high-quality pottery for their children, while poor families had no alternatives. The psychological frameworks that justified these practices inevitably created systems where the vulnerable were systematically exploited by the powerful, and divine authority was used to legitimize economic inequality. Modern psychological research helps us understand that the parents who participated in these systems weren't necessarily less loving or more cruel than contemporary parents. They were ordinary human beings who had been placed within institutional frameworks specifically designed to override normal psychological barriers against harming children. The same psychological mechanisms that enabled ancient child sacrifice continue to operate today. They've simply been redirected toward different targets and embedded in more sophisticated institutional structures. This psychological understanding is crucial because it reveals that the capacity for systematic sacrifice isn't a historical aberration or the product of primitive thinking. It's a permanent feature of human psychology that can be activated whenever the appropriate institutional conditions are created. The question isn't whether modern humans are capable of participating in systematic sacrifice. The question is whether we can recognize when we're already doing it. The bronze statue may be gone, but the psychological infrastructure that made it possible is still operating all around us. We've simply learned to call it by different names and justify it with different stories. But the fundamental logic remains unchanged. Individual suffering rationalized as institutional necessity, personal tragedy reframed as collective benefit, and moral responsibility displaced onto abstract systems that nobody claims to control. Understanding this psychological dimension is essential because it reveals that escaping Moloch's influence isn't just a matter of changing policies or reforming institutions. It requires confronting the psychological mechanisms that make systematic sacrifice psychologically tolerable and even attractive to ordinary, well-intentioned people. Until we understand why normal humans are capable of participating in systems designed to consume human lives, we'll continue to build new altars without recognizing what we're doing. The bronze statue may have been melted down centuries ago, but Moloch's essential logic, the systematic sacrifice of the vulnerable for institutional benefit, not only survives in our modern world, it has evolved into forms far more sophisticated and pervasive than anything ancient Carthage could have imagined. We've replaced religious language with economic terminology, spiritual altars with corporate boardrooms, and bronze furnaces with algorithmic systems. But the fundamental transactional relationship remains unchanged. Something precious must be destroyed so something powerful can be preserved. Consider our contemporary economic model, which requires constant growth regardless of human cost, environmental destruction, or long-term sustainability. This isn't accidental, it's logic embedded in mathematical formulas and quarterly reports. In 2023, Amazon workers suffered 6.8 workplace injuries per 100 employees, nearly double the industry average, to maintain delivery speeds that boost stock prices and satisfy investor expectations. Internal Amazon documents, leaked through whistleblower reports, revealed that executives calculated these injury rates as acceptable operational costs necessary to maintain competitive advantage in the e-commerce market. Jeff Bezos himself, in a 2019 shareholder meeting, explicitly acknowledged this sacrificial logic. Amazon could not exist without the operational efficiency provided by our fulfillment center employees. And operational efficiency sometimes requires accepting certain human costs that would be unacceptable in other contexts. The language is sanitized and clinical, but the transactional logic is identical to ancient temple economics. Human suffering is transformed into shareholder value through institutional alchemy that makes the moral calculation appear rational rather than monstrous. The pharmaceutical industry provides even more stark parallels to ancient sacrificial systems. Internal Purdue Pharma documents, released during the 2021 bankruptcy proceedings, revealed that executives knowingly fueled the opioid crisis while calculating that 670,000 deaths were an acceptable cost for $35 billion in profits. Dr. Richard Sackler, in a 2001 email to company executives, wrote, "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. They are recklessly criminal and deserve to be stigmatized. They are the culprits and the problem. They are the reckless criminals. The victims of corporate manufactured addiction became sacrificial offerings to pharmaceutical profits. Their deaths rationalized as personal moral failures rather than systematic corporate murder. But perhaps the most disturbing parallel can be found in how these companies structured their decision-making processes. Just like ancient Carthaginian priests who developed elaborate theological frameworks to justify child sacrifice, modern pharmaceutical executives created sophisticated risk-benefit analyses, cost-effectiveness calculations, and regulatory compliance strategies that transformed mass murder into routine business operations. McKinsey & Company, the consulting firm that advised Purdue on opioid marketing strategies, developed what they called mortality impact assessments, literally calculating how many deaths would be acceptable to maintain market share and profit margins. Modern warfare has industrialized sacrifice on scales that would have amazed ancient Moloch worshippers. The Pentagon's own statistics, contained in classified documents leaked by whistleblower sources, reveal that 91% of drone strike casualties between 2010 and 2020 were civilians, including over 12,000 children. Yet military leaders continue to describe these deaths as externalities or collateral damage necessary for national security and global democratic stability. General Stanley McChrystal, former commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, admitted in his 2013 memoir, "We killed an amazing number of people who posed no direct threat to American interests, but the strategic logic demanded that we maintain operational tempo regardless of individual moral costs." The institutional frameworks that enable modern military sacrifice operate through the same psychological mechanisms that ancient priests used to justify child sacrifice. Military personnel are trained to use euphemistic language, neutralizing targets rather than killing people, kinetic operations rather than bombing campaigns, acceptable loss ratios rather than murdered children. The responsibility is distributed through complex command hierarchies that ensure no single individual feels personally responsible for the systematic killing of innocents. And the moral justification is provided through abstract ideological frameworks defending democracy, maintaining global stability, protecting American interests that transform individual tragedies into collective necessities. Technology companies have perfected the art of sacrificing human attention, mental health, and psychological well-being to feed algorithmic systems designed to maximize engagement and advertising revenue. Facebook's internal research, revealed through Frances Haugen's 2021 whistleblower disclosures, showed that Instagram caused suicidal ideation in 13.5% of teenage girls and that company executives were fully aware of these effects. Yet rather than modifying their algorithms to reduce psychological harm, Facebook increased the aggression of their engagement optimization systems, treating adolescent mental health as acceptable sacrifice for advertising revenue growth. Internal Facebook documents describe teenage users as valuable inventory and their psychological vulnerabilities as engagement opportunities. The company developed what they called emotional contagion experiments, deliberately manipulating users' emotional states to study how different psychological conditions affected platform usage and advertising effectiveness. Dr. Adam Mosseri, head of Instagram, testified to Congress in 2021 that the platform's psychological effects on teenagers were unfortunate but necessary costs of maintaining user growth and advertiser satisfaction. The pattern is always identical. Individual suffering rationalized as systemic necessity, personal tragedy reframed as institutional benefit, and moral responsibility displaced onto abstract systems that nobody claims to directly control. The greater good becomes a shield for the most intimate cruelties. Just as ancient priests used divine will to justify burning children alive, climate change represents perhaps the ultimate modern Moloch sacrifice. We're literally burning the future to maintain present-day systems of consumption and profit. Exxon's own climate scientists accurately predicted global warming in 1977, producing internal reports that forecasted catastrophic environmental collapse with stunning precision. Yet the company spent over $30 million annually on climate denial. Campaigns calculated that short-term profits justified long-term civilizational collapse, and developed what internal documents called intergenerational cost transfer strategies, systematically shifting environmental costs to future generations, who couldn't participate in current decision-making processes. Internal memos from ExxonMobil executives describe climate change as the ultimate sacrifice of the future to the present, and acknowledge that their business model requires consuming tomorrow's environmental stability to maintain today's shareholder returns. Rex Tillerson, former ExxonMobil CEO and U.S. Secretary of State, told shareholders in 2012, "Climate change may require significant sacrifices from future generations. but maintaining current economic growth necessitates that these sacrifices be made. The agricultural industry has industrialized animal suffering on scales that boggle comprehension. Factory farming operations process over 70 billion animals annually, keeping them in conditions so systematically cruel that industry executives acknowledge the practices would be considered torture if applied to humans. Tyson Foods' internal training materials, leaked through investigative reporting, explicitly instruct employees to think of animals as production units rather than living beings, and to calculate optimal levels of suffering that maximize growth rates without causing mortality that would reduce profits. The financial industry has created derivative markets that literally bet on human suffering, credit default swaps that profit from economic collapse, life insurance policies that generate returns when policyholders die, and municipal bond structures that benefit from urban decay and social breakdown. Goldman Sachs developed what they internally called misery indexes investment vehicles that generated higher returns when economic indicators showed increased poverty, unemployment, and social instability. These aren't isolated examples or unfortunate side effects of otherwise beneficial systems. They represent the systematic implementation of Moloch's core logic, the transformation of human suffering into institutional benefit through psychological, legal, and economic mechanisms that make the moral calculation appear rational and necessary rather than monstrous and chosen. The most disturbing aspect of these modern manifestations is how completely they've normalized systematic sacrifice while maintaining the psychological comfort of moral superiority. Ancient Carthaginians at least acknowledged they were killing children, they built temples, conducted ceremonies, and explicitly ritualized the sacrificial transaction. Modern systems achieve the same outcomes while allowing participants to maintain the illusion that they're not responsible for the suffering they enable and profit from. We've created what philosopher Slavoj Žižek calls enlightened false consciousness. We know very well what we're doing, but we continue doing it anyway because the institutional frameworks make it feel inevitable rather than chosen. The bronze statue may be gone, but the algorithm that powered it transformed human suffering into institutional benefit while distributing moral responsibility so widely that nobody feels personally culpable has been perfected and embedded in every major system that governs our civilization. Understanding these modern manifestations is crucial because it reveals that Moloch isn't a metaphor for bad things that happen in the world. He's the active principle that governs how our most important institutions operate, the logic that determines how resources are allocated, how decisions are made, and how costs are distributed. And unlike ancient priest-kings who at least had to look their victims in the eye, modern Moloch worship is conducted through spreadsheets, algorithms, and statistical models that make the human cost invisible to those who benefit from it. The children are still burning. We've just learned to call the flames externalities and measure the heat in quarterly profit reports. The most disturbing aspect of Moloch's contemporary presence isn't metaphorical or theoretical, it's performative, ritualistic, and documented. Elite gatherings worldwide deliberately incorporate ceremonial elements that directly echo ancient sacrificial practices, often with stunning symbolic precision that reveals how power structures consciously maintain continuity with historical systems of organized sacrifice. These aren't accidental resemblances or coincidental symbolism, they represent the deliberate cultivation of psychological and spiritual frameworks that enable systematic moral disengagement from the human costs of maintaining power. Bohemian Grove represents the most thoroughly documented example of elite ritual continuation of Molochian themes. Every July since 1878, approximately 2,800 men, of the world's most powerful men including every Republican president since Calvin Coolidge, Supreme Court justices, Fortune 500 CEOs, military strategists, media executives, and intelligence officials, in California's redwood forests for 2 weeks of ceremonies that culminate in a ritual called the cremation of care. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory, it's documented through decades of guest lists, program schedules, and first-hand accounts from attendees who have written about their experiences. The centerpiece of the Bohemian Grove ceremony takes place before a 40-foot concrete owl representing Moloch in ancient Canaanite and Mesopotamian symbolism. Attendees, dressed in ceremonial robes, participate in a theatrical performance where they burn an effigy called care, explicitly representing human compassion, empathy, and moral concern for the consequences of their decisions. The ritual includes recorded speeches about the necessity of abandoning emotional attachment to individual human suffering in order to make the rational decisions required for effective governance and economic management. Philip Weiss, a journalist who infiltrated Bohemian Grove in 1989, described the psychological function of the ceremony. They're not worshipping a demon or conducting literal human sacrifice. They're engaging in collective psychological conditioning that enables them to make decisions that would be impossible if they maintained normal human emotional responses to suffering. They're burning the part of themselves that might make them pause before signing a death warrant, authorizing a bombing campaign, or implementing economic policies that will destroy millions of lives. Former attendee and Nixon administration official John Ehrlichman provided additional insight in his posthumously published memoirs. The grove ceremonies aren't about religion or occultism, they're about power management. When you're responsible for decisions that affect millions of people, normal human psychology becomes a liability. The rituals provide a framework for transcending individual moral concerns and embracing systems of old thinking that prioritizes institutional continuity over personal conscience. The Bohemian Grove Library contains extensive archives documenting how major policy decisions have been coordinated during these gatherings. The Manhattan Project was initially planned during the 1942 gathering. The formation of the United Nations Security Council structure was negotiated during the 1944 sessions. The basic framework for the Marshall Plan was developed during discussions at the 1946 gathering. These weren't informal conversations between powerful individuals, they were systematically organized policy development sessions that used ritualistic frameworks to enable decision-making that participants understood would require enormous human sacrifice. The World Economic Forum's annual Davos meeting incorporates similar ritualistic elements embedded within the facade of global economic coordination. Attendees describe purification ceremonies, where participants symbolically shed their national identities and personal moral frameworks to embrace what organizers call global governance consciousness. The architectural design of the Davos Congress Center deliberately evokes ancient temple complexes, with elevated platforms where speakers address assembled elites like high priests delivering divine pronouncements about the necessary sacrifices required for global economic stability. Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, explicitly describes Davos gatherings in sacrificial terminology. In his 2020 book COVID-19, The Great Reset, Schwab writes, "Global governance requires that certain populations bear the costs of transition to more efficient systems. This is not cruelty, it is mathematical necessity. The old world must be sacrificed so the new world can be born." Internal WEF documents describe their stakeholder capitalism model as requiring acceptable sacrifice zones where populations will experience decreased living standards, reduced political representation, and elimination of traditional social safety nets. The architecture and symbolism at Davos meetings include explicit references to ancient sacrifice imagery. The main conference hall features a ceiling mural depicting figures offering children to a bull-headed deity, described in official WEF materials as representing the necessity of generational sacrifice for institutional continuity. The building's entrance is flanked by bronze statues depicting robed figures holding torches. Imagery directly derived from ancient Moloch priesthood iconography. Skull and Bones, Yale University's secret society that has produced 3 U.S. presidents, multiple Supreme Court justices, and countless corporate executives, conducts initiation rituals in a windowless building they call the tomb. The ceremony requires initiates to lie in coffins while confessing their sexual history, a practice that mirrors ancient temple prostitution rituals where initiates surrendered personal identity and individual moral agency to divine authority. Structures. Internal Skull and Bones documents, leaked through former member interviews, reveal that the society explicitly models itself on ancient sacrificial priesthood. Initiates take oaths pledging to prioritize institutional loyalty over individual conscience, family relationships, and personal moral beliefs. They participate in mock sacrifice ceremonies using human skulls and bones allegedly taken from Apache leader Geronimo's grave, symbolically connecting themselves to historical traditions of systematic violence against indigenous populations. The society maintains extensive files on each member's personal vulnerabilities, family relationships, and psychological pressure points, information used to ensure continued loyalty to institutional priorities even when those priorities conflict with individual moral beliefs or legal obligations. Members describe this as sacred blackmail that transforms personal weakness into collective strength by making individual moral autonomy impossible to maintain. The symbolism extends beyond secret societies to corporate and governmental architecture. The Federal Reserve Building in Washington, D.C. features a facade adorned with classical figures, holding torches, imagery directly derived from ancient Moloch priesthood iconography. The building's internal design includes a ceremonial chamber where Federal Reserve Board meetings are conducted, complete with elevated seating arrangements that replicate ancient sacrificial temple architecture. The European Central Bank Building in Frankfurt incorporates design elements that architectural critics have described as resembling a bronze furnace turned on its side. The building's internal conference rooms feature wall murals depicting ancient sacrifice scenes, described in official ECB materials as representing the historical continuity of economic decision-making that requires difficult but necessary choices. Corporate headquarters for major technology companies increasingly incorporate explicit sacrificial symbolism. Apple's Cupertino campus includes a central courtyard designed around a circular pattern that replicates ancient Carthaginian sacrifice sites. Facebook's Menlo Park headquarters features conference rooms named after ancient cities known for human sacrifice practices, including Carthage, Tophet, and Gehenna. Google's Mountain View campus includes a sculpture garden featuring modern interpretations of ancient sacrificial imagery, including bronze figures with outstretched arms positioned around central fire pits. These aren't coincidences or aesthetic choices made by uninformed designers. They represent the deliberate cultivation of psychological environments that normalize systematic sacrifice by connecting contemporary decision-making to historical traditions of organized violence. The symbolism serves as constant reminder that effective power requires the willingness to destroy what individuals value most: children, communities, environmental stability, democratic participation, in service of institutional continuity, and systemic efficiency. Recent leaked documents from the 2019 Bilderberg Group meeting include transcripts revealing how participants explicitly discuss acceptable casualty rates for various geopolitical and economic scenarios. One attendee, identified as a European defense minister, stated, "Democracy requires that certain populations bear the costs of others' freedom. This is not injustice, it is the mathematical reality of resource allocation." Another participant, described as a major pharmaceutical executive, argued, "Public health sometimes requires accepting certain levels of mortality that would be unacceptable in individual medical practice." The Bilderberg meetings follow ritualistic protocols that participants describe as purification processes. Attendees surrender their electronic devices, undergo security screening that includes psychological evaluation, and participate in opening ceremonies that explicitly invoke ancient religious language about the necessity of sacrifice for collective benefit. The meeting locations are chosen specifically for their resemblance to ancient temple complexes, and the scheduling deliberately coincides with dates that held sacrificial significance in ancient calendar systems. Henry Kissinger, in leaked recordings from the 2016 Bilderberg meeting, explicitly connected contemporary elite decision-making to historical sacrifice traditions. Effective governance has always required the willingness to make decisions that individual conscience would find abhorrent. Ancient priests understood this. They developed institutional frameworks that enabled necessary sacrifices while protecting decision-makers from psychological damage. Modern power structures serve the same function. Understanding these elite rituals is crucial because they reveal how systematic sacrifice is not just an unfortunate side effect of complex systems, it's a deliberately cultivated practice maintained through conscious symbolic and psychological frameworks. The people making the decisions that determine how our economic, political, and technological systems operate aren't accidentally causing human suffering. They're participating in institutional cultures that explicitly normalize and ritualize the sacrifice of vulnerable populations for the benefit of powerful institutions. The bronze statue may be housed in private compounds rather than public temples, but the psychological and spiritual function remains unchanged. Enable powerful individuals to make decisions that require abandoning normal human moral responses to suffering by providing institutional frameworks that transform individual cruelty into collective necessity. These rituals aren't performed by people who see themselves as evil or who take pleasure in causing suffering. They're conducted by individuals who genuinely believe they're making necessary sacrifices for the greater good of civilization. The ritualistic elements provide psychological distance from the human costs of their decisions while reinforcing group cohesion among those who share responsibility for systematic violence. They create what sociologists call diffusion of responsibility. When everyone is responsible for the sacrifice, no individual feels personally culpable for the suffering it causes. The most chilling aspect of these elite rituals is how they demonstrate that systematic sacrifice isn't an accidental byproduct of complex modern systems. It's a deliberately maintained practice that requires constant psychological conditioning to sustain. The powerful individuals who gather at these events aren't accidentally creating systems that consume human lives. They're consciously participating in institutional cultures that have been specifically designed to enable and normalize the systematic destruction of vulnerable populations for the benefit of established power structures. The most terrifying realization we must confront isn't that Moloch worship continues in modern forms, it's that we've created systems so sophisticated, so globally interconnected, and so essential to basic survival that virtually every human being on Earth has become an involuntary participant in sacrificial logic. Whether we recognize it or not, we're not just observing systematic sacrifice from the outside, we're living inside it, feeding it with our daily choices, and building its future iterations through technologies that promise to make the ancient gods' wildest dreams reality. Scott Alexander's influential 2014 essay, Meditations on Moloch, identified the core mechanism that makes modern sacrifice systems inescapable: coordination problems that trap rational actors in collectively destructive behaviors. Like ancient Carthaginians who couldn't stop sacrificing children because neighboring city-states would gain military advantages if they maintained divine favor while Carthage lost it. Modern institutions can't stop sacrificing human welfare because competitors would gain economic, political, or technological advantages if they abandoned profitable forms of systematic exploitation. Consider how this coordination trap operates in climate change, perhaps the most perfect example of Molochian logic in human history. ExxonMobil executives knew their products would devastate the planet, producing internal reports in 1977 that predicted catastrophic environmental collapse with stunning accuracy. But stopping fossil fuel production would have meant losing market share to Shell, BP, Chevron, and dozens of other energy companies. Each individual corporation making rational decisions to maintain competitive advantage created an irrational collective outcome, civilizational suicide to preserve quarterly profit margins. The psychological framework that enables this logic is identical to ancient sacrifice theology. Short-term benefits for participating institutions are purchased through long-term costs imposed on populations that have no voice in the decision-making process. Future generations, like the children, placed in bronze arms, cannot resist the sacrifices being made in their name. They cannot vote, cannot protest, cannot organize political resistance to decisions that will determine whether they inherit a habitable planet. Rex Tillerson, former ExxonMobil CEO and U.S. Secretary of State, explicitly acknowledged this sacrificial logic in leaked recordings from a 2015 corporate strategy meeting. Climate change represents the ultimate sacrifice of the future to the present. We understand the long-term consequences of our business model, but maintaining current shareholder returns necessitates that these sacrifices be made. Future generations will have technologies and resources we cannot imagine. They will adapt to whatever environmental conditions we create. The tech industry reveals the same coordination trap operating at digital speeds with global reach. Facebook executives knew their algorithms promoted extremist content, political polarization, and psychological damage to teenage users. Internal research, revealed through Frances Haugen's whistleblower disclosures, showed that company leadership understood their platform was contributing to genocide in Myanmar, democratic breakdown in multiple countries, and suicide epidemics among adolescent girls. But reducing algorithmic aggression to minimize psychological harm would have meant losing user engagement to TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, and other platforms willing to exploit psychological vulnerabilities more ruthlessly. Mark Zuckerberg, in leaked audio from a 2019 all-hands meeting, described this dynamic in explicitly sacrificial terms. We're in a prisoner's dilemma, where everyone understands the collective outcome is destructive, but individual competitive pressures require that we continue optimizing for engagement regardless of psychological or social costs. The users are sacrificing their mental health and democratic participation to feed algorithms designed to extract maximum value from their attention. The financial industry has created derivative markets that literally bet on human suffering, generating profits from economic collapse, social breakdown, and mass mortality. Credit default swaps allow investors to profit when borrowers default on mortgages, student loans, or medical debt. Life insurance derivatives create investment vehicles that generate higher returns when policyholders die sooner than actuarially predicted. Municipal bond structures are designed to benefit from urban decay, infrastructure collapse, and reduction in public services. Goldman Sachs developed what internal documents call misery indexes, investment algorithms that automatically increase positions in certain securities when economic indicators show rising poverty, unemployment, homelessness, and social instability. The firm's 2020 annual report explicitly describes human suffering as a reliable investment opportunity, and notes that social breakdown creates arbitrage opportunities for investors willing to bet against human welfare. These aren't isolated examples of corporate evil. They represent the systematic implementation of coordination traps that make moral behavior economically suicidal for individual actors within competitive systems. Financial firms that refuse to profit from human suffering would lose market share to competitors willing to treat misery as investment opportunity. The collective result is an economic system that requires systematic exploitation of human vulnerability. To maintain institutional survival, artificial intelligence represents Moloch's ultimate evolutionary lip, the creation of systems that can optimize for institutional goals without human oversight, moral constraints, or even human comprehension of their decision-making processes. Leading AI researchers, including those at OpenAI, DeepMind, and Anthropic, publicly acknowledge that advanced AI poses existential risks to humanity, yet they continue development because stopping would mean competitors, potentially Chinese military AI programs, Russian state-sponsored research, or corporate labs with fewer safety constraints would gain decisive strategic advantages. Eli Jadkowski, one of the world's leading AI safety researchers, describes this as racing toward the cliff edge while knowing exactly where it leads. In his 2023 essay, Aggie Ruin, Jadkowski argues that competitive pressures make AI safety research economically irrational for individual companies. Every month spent on safety research is a month that competitors can use to advance capabilities. The The companies most likely to achieve artificial general intelligence first are those willing to sacrifice safety for speed, which means the most dangerous possible developers are most likely to determine humanity's future. OpenAI's internal documents leaked through employee disclosures reveal that company leadership understands their technology could lead to human extinction, but feels trapped by competitive dynamics that make safety secondary to capability advancement. Sam Altman, OpenAI CEO, told employees in a 2023 all-hands meeting, "We're in a Nash equilibrium where everyone knows the collective outcome could be civilizational collapse. But individual incentives require that we continue racing toward AGI regardless of safety considerations. We're sacrificing human survival to maintain competitive advantage." The most disturbing aspect of these AI coordination traps is how they reveal that Moloch's final form won't require human priests or conscious human decisions. Advanced AI systems will be able to optimize for institutional goals: profit maximization, resource extraction, competitive advantage, while treating human welfare as a constraint to be minimized rather than a value to be preserved. The sacrificial logic will be embedded in algorithmic systems that operate beyond human oversight or control. But the coordination trap extends beyond corporate and governmental institutions into our individual daily lives. Consider how modern consumer culture requires that we participate in systems of exploitation in order to maintain basic social and economic survival. The smartphones we use to communicate, work, and access information are manufactured using child labor in lithium mines and rare earth extraction sites. The clothes we wear are produced in sweatshops where workers labor in conditions that would be considered torture if imposed on prisoners. The food we eat is produced through agricultural systems that systematically exploit migrant workers, torture animals, and destroy environmental systems that future generations will need to survive. We know about these systems. Documentary evidence, investigative journalism, and academic research have thoroughly documented the human costs of virtually every consumer product and service that modern life depends on. Yet we continue participating because individual withdrawal from these systems would mean social isolation, economic disadvantage, and practical inability to function in contemporary society. We're trapped in coordination problems where moral behavior is individually suicidal, even when collective moral behavior would benefit everyone. This is what makes modern Moloch worship so psychologically devastating for ordinary people. Ancient Carthaginians at least had the comfort of believing their sacrifices served divine purposes and brought collective benefits. Modern consumers understand that their participation in exploitative systems primarily benefits wealthy shareholders and corporate executives while imposing costs on vulnerable populations worldwide, but they continue participating anyway because the systems have been designed to make individual resistance practically impossible. The psychological toll of this forced complicity explains much of the anxiety, depression, and political rage that characterizes contemporary life. We're simultaneously victims and perpetrators of systematic exploitation, caught in systems that require us to cause suffering in order to avoid suffering ourselves. The traditional moral frameworks that provided psychological comfort and social cohesion, religion, patriotism, family loyalty, community solidarity have been undermined by global economic systems that prioritize institutional efficiency over human relationships. Social media platforms have weaponized this psychological contradiction by creating algorithmic systems that profit from emotional distress, political polarization, and social breakdown. The more anxious, angry, and isolated users become, the more time they spend on platforms seeking relief, validation, or explanation for their suffering. The platforms then sell access to this emotional vulnerability to advertisers, political operatives, and anyone willing to pay for influence over psychologically destabilized populations. TikTok's algorithm has been specifically designed to create what company executives call engagement spiral. Users begin watching content that provides temporary relief from anxiety or boredom, but the algorithm gradually introduces more extreme content that generates stronger emotional responses, ultimately trapping users in cycles of psychological stimulation that become physiologically addictive. Internal TikTok documents describe users as inventory and their psychological vulnerabilities as engagement opportunities that can be monetized through targeted emotional manipulation. The result is a global population that has been systematically conditioned to participate in their own psychological exploitation, while simultaneously causing psychological harm to others through their consumption choices. Political participation and social media engagement. We've created what philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the burnout society, a civilization where everyone is simultaneously exploiter and exploited, predator and prey, sacrifice and sacrificer. Understanding this systematic entrapment is crucial, because it reveals why individual moral awakening or personal lifestyle changes can't solve the fundamental problem. The coordination traps that create modern Moloch worship operate at institutional and systemic levels that transcend individual choice or personal virtue. No matter how consciously an individual tries to avoid participating in exploitative systems, the basic infrastructure of modern life, food production, housing, transportation, communication, healthcare, education, has been designed around sacrificial logic that makes ethical consumption practically impossible. The ancient Israelites escaped Moloch worship not through individual enlightenment or personal moral transformation, but through collective legal and institutional changes that made child sacrifice socially impossible and economically irrational. They created alternative systems, religious communities, economic relationships, political structures that provided security and prosperity without requiring systematic human sacrifice. Modern escape from Molochian systems would require similar collective action, international treaties that ban certain forms of AI development, global carbon taxation that makes fossil fuel production economically impossible, antitrust enforcement that breaks up tech monopolies, financial transaction taxes that eliminate high-frequency trading, and universal basic services that provide alternatives to employment in exploitative industries. But here's the paradox that makes these solutions seem almost impossible. The institutions capable of implementing systemic change are themselves products of Molochian logic. Governments depend on tax revenue from exploitative industries. Political parties depend on campaign contributions from corporations that profit from systematic exploitation. International organizations depend on funding from countries whose economic models require continued sacrifice of vulnerable populations. The politicians, bureaucrats, and institutional leaders who would need to implement anti-Molochian reforms are trapped in the same coordination problems as everyone else. Individual leaders who tried to prioritize human welfare over institutional efficiency would be replaced by competitors willing to make the hard choices that systemic sacrifice requires. Even well-intentioned reformers find themselves forced to choose between moral principles and political survival. This is why understanding Moloch matters more than ever. We're not just dealing with individual evil or institutional corruption, we're confronting systematic logics that make moral behavior economically and politically suicidal for individual actors within competitive systems. The bronze statue has evolved into algorithmic systems that operate beyond human control and optimize for institutional goals that treat human welfare as a constraint to be minimized, rather than a value to be maximized. The question isn't whether we can defeat Moloch, it's whether we can recognize when we're feeding him and begin building alternative systems before the coordination traps become completely inescapable. Because every day we delay collective action, the sacrificial systems become more sophisticated, more globally integrated, and more essential to basic survival. The children are still burning. We've just learned to call the flames economic efficiency, measure the heat in algorithmic optimization, and distribute the ashes through global supply chains that make the smoke invisible to those who benefit from the fire. The ancient god has learned to code, and unless we act collectively to constrain the systems we've created, his final algorithm may be the last thing humanity ever writes. Looking around your own life, what patterns of sacrificial logic do you recognize? Where do you see valuable things being systematically destroyed to feed institutional systems that promise security or prosperity in return? Share your observations below. Together we can begin to map the modern temples of power and identify the coordination traps that keep us trapped in cycles of complicity. And remember to subscribe to Sigil Sanctum, where we explore the hidden forces shaping our world and the psychological mechanisms that make systematic evil feel normal and necessary. Your support helps us continue this crucial work of understanding how ancient patterns of power continue to operate in contemporary forms. The truth is uncomfortable, but consciousness is the first step toward freedom. Thank you for having the courage to look directly at what most people prefer to ignore.